Kansas, I've realized that this must be one of the worst states to be an atheist in the nation. Churches in Kansas are like Starbucks around the rest of the country. They're everywhere and everyone goes to them. When you first meet people, it's not odd for them to ask which church you go to or what religion you are. As an atheist, I've often lied and said I was Christian or that I didn't belong to one church. This is out of pure survival. I just want to avoid the dirty looks and disgusted words that pour out of my new Christian acquaintance. Of course, this doesn't happen every time. There have been many moments when I've shared my beliefs and my new friend acted very Christ-like. These are the best encounters. I've been an atheist for quite a few years, and some of my closest friends still don't know. Telling my mom was easy, since she actually practices what she preaches. She barely batted an eyelash when I told her. However, I didn't tell her for a few years because I thought this might be the one thing that she isn't cool with. Other family members were not as accepting. When I first came out to other members of my family, I saw the flash of hatred on their faces. My favorite invalidating response was one of them saying that my atheism was just a phase. How many of you have heard that? Yeah. Deciding when you disclose your true beliefs can be a daunting experience. When you begin to meet new people and befriend some of them, often personal views and experiences will be brought up. When you're an atheist, this can get uncomfortable very quickly. Sometimes you want to say, I don't believe in God, and leave the situation at that. Yet you have to wonder, how will they react? Badly? Is this the type of person who will hurt me? Maybe. And ultimately decide, this person may be a Bible-thumping Christian, so it's best to play it safe and keep your mouth shut. So I want to ask you all, how would you define or describe this experience that Brittany's talking about? Yeah.
Very classic, very common.
Common, typical. Yeah. What's actually happening to her here?
Imagine she's afraid. Anxiety. At least isolated.
Yeah. Isolated, afraid, what else?
Anxiety.
Anxiety.
Self-censoring.
Self-censoring.
Repressed.
So when I put out my call for narratives for the book that I wrote, this was in 2011, I think, when I put out the initial call, hers was probably one of the first, if not the first one I received. So I think she probably had this written and was just waiting to do something with it. But she's a college student from Kansas. She goes to a small Methodist school. I Googled just information on her school, and it turns out that the most famous people that have come from her school have been ministers, bishops. So we're talking about really, really, truly a religious institution. So have you had people treat you in the ways that she's describing? We've been talking about this a lot for the past day, and I'm sure you talked about it a little bit yesterday too. So what I want you to do, you're in the habit of talking about these hopefully by this point, is I want you to actually get up and move around a little bit. I want you to identify somebody that you have not spoken to at all throughout the course of the conference, and you're going to pair up with them. And once you have paired up with people, I will give you further instruction. I know we're all socially awkward, let's do it. So what I'm going to have you do, which is going to be really difficult and counterintuitive for a lot of people, is I'm actually going to set my timer, and a frog will start ribbiting when your time is up. I'm going to have each of you in your group spend 2 minutes talking uninterrupted and giving an example of one of these experiences where you felt either marginalized or isolated because of your atheism. So the other person, while you're telling your story, can't ask any questions, can't say anything. Your goal is just to listen. At 2 minutes, this will start quacking or ribbiting or something, and then you'll switch. Okay? You ready? Okay, go. All right, so time's up. First of all, I want to ask you, what was that like, either to be the listener or the speaker? Yeah.
You really, really want to talk.
You do. It kind of pours out of you. And I have to say that, I guess it's kind of funny to admit this after being a professor for a while now, that when I'm asked to do stuff like this, I initially have a surge of panic. I'm like, how am I going to fill 2 minutes? And then it really does flow out of you. What about listeners? What was it? Oh, go ahead.
So it just felt awkward. I couldn't
sorry that it made you feel awkward. That wasn't the intention. Yeah.
There was a very strong desire to say things like yeah or and to provide some sort of signal. And it was like, it got to be like after the 1 minute mark, I think I finally relented and I said yeah or something. It was very difficult.
Yeah, and I think that comes from the impulse to really want to make a person feel validated, but also we're so used to hearing somebody kind of share and wanting to either jump in with something like a comment that comes from our own experience that we really lose sight of how to actually kind of listen and be present and just hear things. Yeah.
I think there's a valuable lesson though, because when you're listening, when I'm listening, I feel tempted to fill that kind of thing and to show, validate that I'm listening. But then when I'm talking, I'm not thinking, why are you saying anything? So it sort of demonstrates, they'll have to say, yeah, they know you're listening.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to ask you all, since you've just done this, I know that James asked you to kind of reflect on emotions that these experiences brought up for you a lot. And I want to challenge you to do that again. So recalling some of these experiences, if some of you have had them, acknowledging that some of you might have not, what are kind of the physical reactions that you have when you've potentially been through one of these things? What thoughts go through your head? What happens when you feel either invalidated or something like this occurs?
I get really angry.
So a lot of anger. Yeah.
Frustration.
Frustration.
I got an anonymous letter and it felt really hurt.
Hurt. So hurt, sadness. Where do you feel stuff in your body? I know this sounds like a woo question, but where is it? Yeah.
In my shoulders, like, my chest.
So you actually are having physical stress reactions a lot of times when something like this happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel kind of guilty for like something get really sad about it. So I kind of feel like heavy in my stomach, just like guilt of just like they're so upset by this that I should just.
So you're feeling it for other people when you, or those are where you feel it yourself?
I feel kind of guilty for making people because they get so upset about it, and I'm frustrated that they shouldn't get so upset about it.
One more comment. Yeah.
I second that. Like, I haven't told my grandparents because I feel like it's not a large enough part of my identity to make them want to convert me for the rest of their time on Earth. But there's moments where I feel like I'm being dishonest with them. Like every time we go to eat, we have to pray, and kind of, I bow my head and I just sit there and I'm like, I feel like I'm lying.
Yeah.
I feel right.
And I think what you're describing and what Brittany described in her narrative is such a good snapshot of what it means to experience minority stress. And you might not have heard that actual phrase combined before, or you might have, but it kind of describes the psychological consequences of experiencing stigma, expecting that you're going to experience stigma, even if you haven't already, knowing that there's something about your identity that other people aren't going to like and they're going to respond to, and either having to conceal it or having to modify it, and how that creates kind of a chronically stressful environment for people to live in. So I want to ask you to do a couple of things. The first is think back on when you had one of these experiences. You've just shared one. What did you do at first to make yourself feel better when you've had one of these stressful experiences? Just somebody give me one. Yeah.
It made me feel motivated to because it was when I tried to do some activism, I got serious backlash. It just made me motivated to do more of it because I saw that necessary.
So motivated to do activism. Okay, can you stand up if you also felt motivated to do activism? We're just going to get blood flowing. There's no, let's just do it. You've been sitting a lot. Okay. What's another one? What's a response you had immediately? Yeah.
Desire to find somebody else who shares the same experiences.
Yes. Is anybody else that is not standing, did you have that reaction? Oh, this worked out so good. Awesome. Okay, you can all sit down. So my point in illustrating this is that when we have a stressful experience, initially the first reactions that we have involve other people, telling other people or connecting with other people that will understand our experiences. And both of those things are so highly related to community that it's not even funny. That's what you do. You try and reach out for community. Has anybody not had that feeling? Like, yeah, go ahead.
So when I
sounds like you kind of didn't have to do that because you had that. You had these people that you identified from the get-go. And I think that's a really beautiful, powerful thing. And I think being in a room full of community organizers, this is something that you're clearly passionate about. But what I want you to leave this talk with is some sort of motivation and evidence that you can provide to other people who say we don't need an atheist community. Because I think we hear that all the time, or at least I do. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because I had never really had God in my life or not God in my life. It just wasn't there, so I didn't realize I was missing anything. And so when I actually was like, oh yeah, I guess I don't believe in God, and then realized there was a community to even go to, I didn't realize what I was missing out on. That I actually really needed and really enjoyed having people to talk about that stuff with.
Yeah, and I think that especially in bigger cities that can be a common experience where most of your friends are already secular, but there's still something nice about it. And again, we can talk about that too and talk about what avenues there are for doing that. So I want to orient you a little bit as to how I got into this. So I actually consider myself to be a minority stress researcher. So what that means is I attend to people's experiences from marginalized groups. So I started off primarily working with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer individuals, and also people of color, people with disabilities, any sort of marginalized group experience. I was interested in learning about how discrimination, stigma, all of that translates to mental health outcomes. And so I have a research group at Columbia. This is what we kind of live and breathe. I actually, as a side note, this is a rotating picture, and so many of the pictures involve us eating ribs because they were taken at this barbecue restaurant. I had to really wait to take a screenshot. It was super embarrassing. So minority stress theory, how many of you have actually heard of this before? A couple people. That's good. Okay, good. So this won't be that redundant for many people. So everybody experiences stressors. That's a part of being human. It's part of life. As psychologists, we tend to think of stressors as kind of events and conditions, and they can be positive or negative, things like losing a job, things like even starting a new relationship, moving to a different city, things that cause changes in your life and you have to respond to them. You have to adapt to those situations. So everyone has stress. But minority stress refers to kind of the unique and excessive stress that results from having some sort of stigmatized characteristic about your identity. And so minority stress is particularly for people who have some sort of marginalized or minority identity. And it's different from regular types of general stress in that it's unique, so not everybody experiences it. It's also chronic, so unless your identity changes, you're not going to stop experiencing this, or unless there's some really crazy overhaul of what we think of as a marginalized identity in the US, it's not going to shift. And it's also socially based, so the stress that you experience stems from institutions and structures that are often beyond your control. So in psychology, there have been tons and tons of studies looking at minority stress, but primarily, or almost exclusively, not with secular people or non-believers. But what we know is that experiences of minority stress, so having discrimination experiences, feeling stigmatized, feeling isolated, feeling like you can't talk about your identities, those are each linked to all of these pretty severe psychological outcomes. So things like higher levels of depression, anxiety, suicidality, eating disorder symptoms, substance use, risky sex behavior. So we see a very clear linkage between these experiences and these mental health concerns. And when I say that there has been a lot of research done, I mean that this is just me going on Google Scholar and pulling out a few. There's thousands and thousands of studies that show this relationship. And this relationship across many different groups. So women of all races, people of color specifically, lesbian and gay individuals, bi individuals, trans people, religious minority groups, people with disabilities. We see these correlations in these relationships. And the idea is that minority stress theory can be used to explain group differences in mental health outcomes. So I want to give you a case illustration with lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, because I think that within the atheist community, there's been a lot of kind of commandeering of the outness language. And I should say that when I talk about LGBT people, I'm not trying to say that LGBT people and atheists have completely similar experiences. because I'm not. I think in many ways we're very, very different from the queer community. But I do think that there are some notable overlaps that are actually worth examining, especially when it comes to minority stress, because we do have some similarities in that, for the most part, identifying as LGB or identifying as atheist is a hidden identity, as opposed to potentially, not always, identifying as a person of color, identifying as a woman. These are more visible identities often. So, just to orient you a little bit, as of a recent poll, we're talking 2013, even with marriage equality, 41% of Americans still profess that they think that lesbian gay relationships are morally wrong. So legal changes, such as, again, marriage equality, don't always reflect trends in public opinion or how people actually feel. However, this is a better percentage than people who think atheist relations are morally wrong. Just keep that in mind. So that view here about lesbian and gay people being morally wrong is an example of heterosexist prejudice, which refers to things like homophobia, homonegativity, biphobia against bisexual people, bi-negativity. And it's thought to be this ideological system that denies or denigrates one's experience because it's not heterosexual. And the thing I want you to keep in mind as we go through the presentation tonight is that prejudicial views in themselves, while we might think they're wrong and bad and people obviously shouldn't have them, they wouldn't be as much of a concern if they stayed in people's minds. So if people just thought bad things, we wouldn't necessarily want to be friends with them, but that'd be okay. Prejudice is a problem because these views actually motivate behavior. They translate to direct interactions with other people. And these interactions can be minor. I put that in air quotes because even microaggressions have a really significant emotional impact on people. When I say microaggressions, what do I mean? Is anybody familiar with that term? Yeah.
Me?
Yes, yeah.
Basically, okay, so an example, when you say you're like a white person, you assume your experience is typical of the American experience.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of assumes that the experience of, person of color is very similar to yours.
Yes, so whoever has the dominant kind of powerful narrative in a culture imposing their views on other people. So really kind of typical example that's been used to talk about LGBTQ issues is when somebody might ask a woman, oh, do you have a boyfriend? So assuming automatically that because she's a woman, she's going to be partnered with a man. An example that gets talked about a lot from an atheist framework would be asking somebody what church they go to. So automatically assuming that they will be Christian if they live in a certain area of the US. And again, if you're atheist, that sends you a message, right? Like, this person might not be safe. They're already making these assumptions about me. Oh boy, what am I going to do now? How am I going to counter this now that they already think that? So that's at the kind of the lesser end. And then, of course, these views can motivate things as severe as hate crimes or discrimination, potentially not getting promotions, things like that. So in terms of minority stress theory, again, from an LGB framework, we've talked about 4 primary dimensions. And I think as we go through these, you'll see that they may or may not, but probably may, be relevant in many ways to the experiences of atheist and agnostic and non-believer people too. So the first one that we talked about already is kind of prejudice or discrimination. And the theory talks about this as kind of a distal stressor. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. And then these other 3, so perceiving that you're going to experience stigma, having to conceal your sexual orientation or identity, and then internalized heterosexism, those are all talked about as proximal stressors. And again, we'll talk about that. You don't have to memorize that. So distal stressors, which are things like discrimination, can take the form of interpersonal discrimination. So verbal harassment, potentially a hate crime, feeling excluded from a social event that all your friends are invited to because of your identity or your belief system. Then there can also be an institutionalized element to discrimination. So these could be federal laws, like not having employment protection, which we still don't have, if you identify as a sexual orientation minority. Stop and frisk policies, institutionalized prejudice, right? TSA screenings based on what you look like or what your last name sounds like. Those are all distal stressors. So these are kind of objective things that occur to somebody because of their identity, but anybody could see them. They're happening. Proximal stressors are a little bit different, and they're called proximal because they require the person to take some sort of evaluative stance on a distal stressor that has either occurred to them or occurred to somebody that they love. So if they saw a loved one potentially be victim of a gay bashing, for example, you could have vicarious trauma because of that. But proximal stressors, so something like expected stigma, you've seen discrimination occur, you've seen institutionalized hatred potentially, and then you expect that it'll occur to you because you have the same identity. Same thing with internalized negative societal attitudes. You start to question, maybe because of my identity and people saying that people from my group are bad, maybe I really am bad. And so you start to think that too. And then concealment makes a lot of sense. If you feel like you or loved ones that you have that share your identity are facing all this discrimination, of course you're going to want to hide your identity. Why would you want to tell people if it's been linked to so many bad things? And I know that that is depressing, and this talk is not only going to be depressing, I promise you. So the theory, again, theory with lots and lots of research, those thousands of articles, also suggests that there are factors that intervene in this model. And intervening meaning that they can either buffer or prevent all of those stressful things from linking to psychological well-being. And the top one, aspects of identity, just refers to how important your identity is to you, how integrated it is. We're not going to talk about that. What we are going to talk about are these stress ameliorating factors. And so the first one that gets talked about a lot in psychology are interpersonal factors. This means kind of what you do to maintain your mental health. So one of the things that gets discussed a lot, surprise, surprise, is religious belief or spiritual belief. Also, other kind of individual coping strategies like, do you do yoga, or do you know how to calm yourself down when you're getting agitated? So things that you have total control over that you do when stress comes up. That's interpersonal. The part that I want to focus on today is interpersonal. And what do you think interpersonal refers to? A tween people? Oh yeah, sorry, I thought you said like a twink people. I was like, what is he talking about? I don't know what that means. So interpersonal, interpersonal is this. It refers specifically to social support and community support. And often in this literature, again, these thousands of studies, community support is religious community involvement, spiritual community involvement. That's not to say it doesn't work, that's just to say that researchers are really interested in religiosity, right? So if you have all of these stressors, then social and community support can actually intervene here. We call this a moderator. I know it's too much stats talk, I won't bore you. And that can prevent some of the negative mental health outcomes from occurring. So it's important. Okay, but what does that have to do with atheist people? Well, if we think back on Brittany's narrative, she was clearly experiencing some dimensions of minority stress. She expected stigma, she was vigilant for it, she was concealing her identity, she was chronically worried about disconnection from people. And you have to wonder, maybe you don't have to wonder because you're here, but where that actually comes from. And so I'm going to do exactly what James said I shouldn't do and throw out some stats at you, right? So since 1992, when Americans are polled, and this is across a number of different survey platforms, national studies, we find that roughly 80 to 90% of Americans still claim that religion is very important in their lives. So even if church attendance is kind of falling off a cliff, religious belief is still somewhat strong, 80 to 90%, polled regularly since 1992. The other thing to keep in mind is that this manifests in kind of interesting and peculiar ways, but perhaps ways you would expect. So again, since 1937, 1948, 1989, this is just to show that each of the times the survey is administered, roughly 70% of Americans still believe in an afterlife. So again, religious beliefs and all that comes with it are still quite strong. What that means is that non-believers are still very much a minority in numbers and in practice. And what that can create is a feeling of exclusion, of isolation, and a feeling that there's actually something wrong with you. And I think that if you have grown up secular in a larger city where there's a larger secular community, some of this might not be relevant for you. But those of you that have grown up in very religious communities, this probably will resonate pretty strongly. So this is another quote from Atheist in America. It's by Adrienne Falardo-Fagan. She's a Puerto Rican American woman from Gainesville. She works as a grant specialist. I used to play roller derby with her. She's great. And she wrote, as a kid, what I wanted more than a Barbie dream house was to feel God the way my family did. Looking back now, I realize that this was my child self's desire to fit in. So, show of hands, if you feel comfortable, how many of you kind of had a similar experience of really wanting to feel God? Yeah. I mean, I can say that I felt very confused when I looked around and I'm like, what is everybody feeling? Why don't I feel it? And that does feel like there's something wrong, that you're broken in some way. And what does that sound like when we think about this minority stress framework? Feeling like there's something wrong. Yeah, some sort of internalized stress. A little bit like internalized heterosexism in some ways. Striving to be something that you're not because you feel like there's something wrong with the way you are. And I've had experiences like this for a long time. Even when I was in grad school, you talk about the ivory tower being kind of safe from this type of attitude. And that's simply not the case. So when I was in grad school, there's me. I spent so much time on this slide, it's ridiculous. I really should have been doing something else, but you can pretend that's me talking back to the professor. So I think one of the clearest examples of just when you think you're clear of this, something crops up again. So this was in Florida, which again isn't a super liberal nest, but graduate school in psychology is supposed to be. So I was taking a career class, and essentially you learn in this class how to do career counseling with clients. So you learn about a whole bunch of different theories and how to help people find what occupations they want. It's an interesting class. And one of the theories that we learn about is called planned happenstance theory, which I don't expect you to know about. It's by a guy named John Crumboltz. But essentially, what Crumboltz says is that you can do as much career counseling as you want, but ultimately you need to teach people that they have to just prepare the best they can, and they can't control for life events, and so you have to teach them to roll with it. That career opportunities will arise, they need to be ready just to jump on opportunity. So kind of turn serendipity into opportunity, that sort of stuff. So it was a small seminar class, and people reacted to this theory in interesting ways. They're like, oh yeah, that really resonates with me. And what I would do is I would tell my clients to just trust in the universe and to believe that everything will work out the way it should. And they'll find that to be really comforting. Or they would say, believe God has a plan, and that will help them get a job. And I was sitting there thinking, because I was much less bold back then, I was like, this sounds like woo. Like, if somebody said that to me, I would never come back to that career counselor. I'd be really put off. And so I sat there uncomfortably for a while, and then I managed to kind of squeak something out. And I was like, I don't think that you should say that to everybody. That sounds like pseudoscience to me. It would make me uncomfortable. And one of my good friends who was in the class with me, kind of turned to me and said, I don't know, I think most people would like that. You'd have to be a capital A atheist not to like those things. That'd be really comforting. And I was just like, oh God, no. And I was like, okay, I guess I am a capital A atheist. And her reaction to me in that moment was a blank stare. And then she said, but you're so nice. Boom. And so that really started a lot of this line of research. And it really spawned the question, since when are nice and atheist these mutually exclusive terms? Because I think most people that are not secular tend to feel that way. And so I went through kind of a checklist. What about me says that I'm not atheist, first of all? Well, I'm a woman. I'm also pretty community oriented. I'm pretty okay with religious groups as long as they don't try to take away my rights, and then I get mad. But I don't tend to enjoy debating. It's totally great if you do. I'm really glad when people do, but it's just not for me. And I think that in that way I violate a lot of the stereotypes of atheist. And so in some ways, people initially don't know what to do with me when they hear that I'm atheist. Because, and I know we've had these conversations a little bit today already, when we think of atheists, we think of a very particular demographic. It gets better, just wait. Woo! Okay. And this is generally who they see. So Harris Dawkins Nye. Occasionally, we try to claim Neil deGrasse Tyson, like how he slid up from the bottom. But actually, he's been pretty adamant that he doesn't identify as atheist. He's agnostic. So we can't really do that. But the theme amongst these men is, first of all, they're men, largely white, largely well-educated. But they're not necessarily viewed as particularly welcoming or particularly warm. Even Bill Nye, who I absolutely love, is very well known for debating. And so not everybody is comfortable with this type of approach. We need to have these approaches in the community for sure, but we can't have this be our only message. Because then we're left with this type of bias towards atheists. So this has been defined as atheophobia. Kind of, it's meant to be parallel to homophobia. Again, I'm not sure how comfortable I feel with all these parallels, but. So it's defined as the fear and loathing of atheists that permeates American culture. And you see it coming up in ways that most of you are very familiar with. So people believing atheists aren't moral, people not wanting their family members to marry an atheist, people not wanting to vote for an atheist candidate. The thing about this that I think often gets left off when we hear the statistic is that atheists were the least likely to get voted for, and ahead of them were people that committed adultery and people that smoked pot, which smoking pot, meh. But like, really, adultery over atheist? Okay, that doesn't make sense to me. Everyone commits adultery? Everyone does it. Oh yeah, the Ashley. Don't even get me started on Ashley Madison, who has highest rates of Christians, apparently. So again, prejudicial views, like I said before, would not be as much of a problem if they stayed where they belonged in people's minds. If you just kind of kept it to yourself, maybe it wouldn't be as bad. But prejudicial views actually do motivate behavior, and they do for atheists too. So there is a small but growing body of literature in psychology, I'm very happy to be a part of it in that way, that shows that atheists do experience interpersonal and structural discrimination. So feeling in child custody cases that was a main reason that they weren't able to hold on to their children, feeling like they were passed up for promotions, feeling isolated, having verbal harassment, slander. And then Joe Hammer, who is a kind of an up-and-coming atheist researcher, really great, I'm sure he'll be doing talks like this in a couple years, surveyed 729 atheists, and one of the things that he found that I think is really surprising, that a lot of people maybe wouldn't have expected, is that atheists experience really severe discrimination too. So it's not just feeling like, oh, it's biased, people don't like me. 16% had been denied opportunities, goods, and services, and roughly 14% had experienced hate crimes. So we're talking about severe reactions to somebody identifying as an atheist. So when you hear people say, yeah, it's not the same, people don't like you, suck it up. No, these things are related to severe consequences. And of course, we have the recent murders of bloggers in Bangladesh. So I think that even though these things might not be happening in the US, the murders, they're in our psyche, they permeate our experience, and they add to the feeling that there's something wrong with our identity. So one of the things you might be wondering, maybe not, unless you're a psychology major, is how does minority stress then impact the mental health of atheists and unbelievers? And what has the research said about this? Because we know that there are thousands of studies that have looked at this. There's 0 studies that have looked at this, but there are thousands of studies that have looked at this with other groups. And I never repeat talks. I think that's really a bad idea. So I gave a talk on this at Skepticon, which I'm not going to do, as signified by that X. But I am going to give you some of the cliff notes from that talk, because I think it's important enough to help frame why this is critical. So psychology has not done work on atheists at this point, largely. We can debate why that is. I'm happy to talk your ear off about why I think that is, point you to things that are written about this. Are there any psychology majors in here? Minors? Any past psychology people? All right, still, good. So I'd say roughly a fifth of you are psychology. What about social work? Anybody? All right, good. So mental health professionals, take note of this. There aren't articles that discuss the impact of minority stress on mental health. Go write them. Find somebody to write them with you. So one of the reasons why I think psychology has not attended to atheism is because we've spent so much damn time as psychologists talking about how religiosity and spirituality impacts mental health. So imagine that this is a really scientific line graph. And here you have psychological well-being on the y-axis. X-axis, you have commitment to faith. So this line would show that the more commitment to faith you have, the more religious you are, the more your levels of psychological well-being shoot up. And what we find in the literature, and if you do a quick search on like EBSCO or Academic Search Complete, any of those sort of scholarly databases, for keywords related to religiosity and mental health, you'll find over 200,000 peer-reviewed articles on this topic. So there's been a lot of research on this. And I think that researchers feel like, because they've spent so much time focusing on religiosity and spirituality, atheists are just the reverse of religious people, right? So if we know that commitment to faith is linked to mental health, just reverse it and whammo, atheists have poor mental health, right? Those are the findings. And you know, I say that tongue in cheek, but that's actually what we've done for the most part, which is really problematic because when we look at these studies closer, we see that there probably aren't even atheists included in these studies, and we can talk about that in a second. But what this line of work has shown is that people that are religious are more satisfied life, more happy, less depressed, less socially isolated. This is probably true, but the others we should question. This research can kind of best be encapsulated by looking at the APA conference. So this is a picture from the APA conference from last year, 2014 in DC. APA is kind of a microcosm of psychology as a whole. Again, I apologize, these two slides are from my Skepticon thing. But so if we look at the types of APA presentations that were done in 2014, there are over 1,000 presentations that are given at APA. You have over 80 that were on religiosity, over 60 that were on spirituality. How many were on atheism? 0? 2. I'm going to assume you didn't already know that. Yes, 2. Woohoo! 2. Yeah, it's okay if you cheated. And one of them was by me and my research team. It was a poster. And the other was by an undergraduate student about atheism at her school, which, you know, I'm glad at least we were there, but I wish there were more of us there. I should say that I'm going to be speaking at APA next week in Toronto, actually, and I'm actually giving a talk. They invited me to give a talk. And it's at a time that isn't 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning, and it's in a building that isn't an annex. All of these things have actually happened to me. So I think change is occurring. So this poster that you're seeing here represents a project that I'm doing with my students that actually is the first that I'm aware of study to look at minority stress specific to atheist people and how it relates to psychological well-being. So I really wanted to kind of provide some quantitative data, because everybody loves numbers and stats, to the experiences that I think we all have, where we know that when we're impacted by discrimination or a friend doesn't like us anymore because we're atheists, we know that impacts mental health, but we need numbers to prove it. So what we did here is we came up with a list of items that are based on kind of experiences that people have written about in prior qualitative literature, in books, in theory, and then we gave out a questionnaire to people. I won't go into too much stats detail on this, but essentially what we found is that these 5 dimensions of discrimination tended to emerge from the data. So these are the 5 kind of most common experiences that people have when it comes to being discriminated for being atheist. And they cluster around these topics, and I think this will make sense to you intuitively. So there's the immorality dimension. So people have treated me like I don't know the difference between right or wrong. People have assumed I'm going to hell because I'm atheist, stuff like that. There's ostracized, so I've been excluded from social gatherings because I'm atheist, lots of experiences around that. Shame. Also, you can think of shame as kind of an immaturity one, so people have told me that my atheism is a source of humiliation for them, or that I should kind of keep it to myself, or I'm going to embarrass my family, those sorts of dimensions. Pretend, which is a pressure to not come out as atheist. So, why don't you just go along with the prayer before we eat Easter dinner? Just be quiet. And then severe, so either being denied opportunities or potentially experiencing some sort of violence towards you or to your property. And so we had these items. We had over 3,000 people take them, validate them. And the thing that we found when we compared scores on these items to dimensions of psychological well-being, specifically we looked at psychological distress, which includes depression and anxiety, and then we also included a measure of loneliness, is that each of these dimensions, shocker, I know, was related to higher levels of distress and higher levels of loneliness. So this is some of the first, again, numerical data that we have that clearly links these experiences. And I say shocker kind of cavalierly, but I think for some people, especially people who are atheist in bigger cities, I encounter this a lot in New York, where I live now, they say, who cares if religious people don't like me? And I think you can't have that attitude, because when you're surrounded by a religious community, when your family members are religious, when your loved ones are, when most of your friends are, it actually really matters what they think about you. And we really do internalize them, and it really does make us feel badly about ourselves and lonely and isolated. And now we can actually show that. So this connects pretty cleanly with minority stress, right? We still need to do much more work on this. This is just one big study. But we also know that coupled with minority stress impacting psychological well-being, there are thousands and thousands of studies with other groups that show that keeping secrets is really, really stressful. So having to hide that you're an atheist person from your friends and family is similarly no bueno for mental health. So there's a real burden to inauthenticity that we have to kind of counter additionally. So the thing I want to go back to is this relationship here. Because now that you all are minority stress experts, you might see this and think, well, yeah, it makes sense that this would be there. Atheists experience so much stress that they're going to have lower levels of psychological well-being because they're so marginalized. And I think intuitively, some of that also resonated the more we started to think critically about this. But I also want to get you to think about what this type of research that shows commitment to faith looks like. And I will tell you that the vast majority of it is done via self-report measures. So the people that participated in these studies, for the most part, were asked to rate how religious they are on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10. So 1, not religious at all. 10, very religious. Or how much they prayed. 1, not very often, to 5, every day. What are you seeing there? If the low scores, yeah.
Do you pray?
What do you mean?
It's how much do you pray?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah. So they're not asking people if they're atheists. They're asking for how often. So if you were a person and you got this survey across you, you're online on Twitter, you're like, oh, I'll take a survey. And the survey didn't ask you if you're atheist, and they said, how often do you pray? And the only option was not that often. Would you stay in that survey? Or would you write the person an angry email? Probably you would write an angry email. Some of you would respond, but your data might not mean that much compared to people that are actually less religious. So what we're really seeing in this is that commitment to faith is looking at people that are very religious and people that are less religious, or engage in these activities less frequently. Because a lot of atheists drop out of these studies. I've gotten lots of emails from atheists about this. So studies that actually include atheist people kind of show that this relationship looks really, really different. They find that the relationship is curvilinear. And this is a big word that I am going to explain. But again, there are a small number of studies that are intentionally including atheist people, spiritual people, agnostic people, and highly religious people. When they are included, this is what it actually looks like. So again, psychological well-being, y-axis, x-axis. If you have totally atheist people, people that are like fuzzy, so I'm going to call people in this category, or the researchers will, agnostic, spiritual, kind of spiritual but not religious, and then highly religious. What these studies are finding now, and again, this is a few, we're talking probably 5 or 6 that are actually looking at this, is that atheist people and religious people look extremely similar. And they look pretty similar across a couple important dimensions. Specifically, those that are very certain of their non-religious beliefs and those that are very certain of their religious beliefs are similar on life satisfaction and emotional stability. They're parallel in substance abuse recovery. They have the same levels of empathy. So in that way, we are parallel. But here's the catch. There are a couple of dimensions where religious people are still kicking our butts. Anybody want to wager what those are? Community. Yeah, I know. It's like I'm spoon feeding it to you. So religious and spiritual people still fare better on coping and social support and subjective well-being. So they feel like they're doing better than we feel like we're doing. And maybe that's just because we're more honest about it. I don't know. We can speculate about that. But why coping and why social support? Well, these are dimensions of community. Because you have somewhere to go, a church, a temple, because you can meet regularly with the same people, because there are systems already in place when you're dealing with major life stressors, like getting married, which, you know, is positive but also a stressor, as anybody that's gotten married has knows. When somebody dies, there's systems in place, religious systems, to help you deal with all this. So religious communities are important buffers for that we simply lack at this point in most areas of the US. So when we talk about psychological well-being from a psychological framework, there are generally 6 accepted dimensions of this. So there are a lot of kind of individual level ones, like self-acceptance, environmental mastery, purpose in life, autonomy, etc. But the other key dimension that we focus on as psychologists is positive relationships with others. So as atheists, we don't have as much control over one aspect of this, how people feel about this. We know that much of America feels like we can't be trusted, we're less moral. We can't necessarily change those views right yet. But what we can do to kind of bolster our psychological well-being in this dimension is make sure that we're fostering and growing positive relationships with other atheists and non-believers, people that will respect us and love us and cherish us and take care of us, and help us buffer that minority stress. So we have some control over it. And I say that this is important because religious congregations are the most common form of association in America. When I say association, that means more common than a bowling league or a club or a team sport, anything like that. Churches and temples beat those in number by far. So again, they're really beating us at this community well-being dimension. And it's going to be hard for us to catch up, especially when we think about the atheist movement as a community. So I really like this quote by Adam Lee. I think it's perfect. He writes that the atheist movement is a loosely knit community of conference goers, advocacy organizations, writers, and activists. So we're some bloggers and some people that like to go to conferences and get beers with each other a couple times a year, for the most part. So we're not really doing this very well to this point. And again, I say this in a room full of community organizers. So I know you're passionate about this. You want to do it. You're already doing it in your home cities. I think one of the reasons that we're really struggling with building an atheist community is that atheists themselves, and I think probably not those of you in this room, because again, you're here, have a really strong visceral reaction to the idea of a community. Like when you put atheist and community together, people automatically go, ugh, why? Why would I need that? So again, I want you to maybe turn to the person next to you. You don't have to move around again. But just chat for a second, and then we'll come back together and talk about this together. But why do you think this exists? And when you've run into this, which I'm positive you have, what have you said to counter it? How have you kind of pushed back against the atheist community, yuck, why do we need it? So I'll give you like 5 minutes, and then let's talk again.
Other people are creative.
All right. Let's reconvene. I spared you hearing my duck timer again. Or maybe it's like if you hear it 7 times, it'll be super funny. That's the rule of comedy, right? I'm not sure. Okay, so atheist community, yuck. Have you encountered this? Show of hands. Yeah, okay. Most people have. So how have you kind of talked back to this when you hear it? Yeah.
So like sometimes I've heard this before, like, oh, well they're gay. Why can't they just be gay? Like why do they have to talk about it? And why do they have to flaunt it? Like I feel like this reaction is kind of the same way. It's a similar sort of like, well, why do you need that?
And what do you do?
Well, I always say I want our community to be the place where you go for when you want to ask somebody to help you move. You look in the phone book and you can see places that have like the cross or the Atheist fish, and so a Christian knows, oh, this place is Christian, so they're going to do me right, even though they might not. But that's kind of what I would like for our community, to be a place where it actually is community instead of just a place for a bunch of people to get around in a circle and pound fists.
Yeah, so it's like a signal that you might have each other's best interest in mind, maybe, and that you will at least be similar on some ideological issues, potentially. Yes, in the back.
So like people bring this up like, why do you need this? Well, it's kind of like, why do you need a church? Like, you go to this place, you can feel comforted. Why can't I go somewhere and feel comforted? Why can't I go somewhere and feel included when you get to go do it and you have millions of them everywhere? So it's kind of like it's like asking someone, well, why do you care? You need it too.
But their favorite thing, and this is, so I'll put this up just so we can admire it. This is like a typical comment thread. I forget which article this was. It was from one of the ones in The Guardian. You know, it's 10 pages of an atheist community. The person that wrote this, I think again it was Adam Lee, said atheist community maybe once in the whole article, and this is what most of the comments are focused on. So that's nothing. In my town, the unicorn denialist group meets every Tuesday. And in one of my studies, we used the phrase atheist community, and I got a lot of hate mail around that. And a couple of the comments, I think 2 or 3 people said the same thing. It's like, well, would you meet for the non-stamp collectors? If you're a non-stamp collector, why would you need to meet and have your own group if you don't collect stamps? And I was just like, really? Because if 90% of the country collected stamps, maybe I would want to meet with other non-stamp collectors. Like it's a moot point. Like it's ridiculous. So besides snarking, how have you convinced people of this? How have you tried to? Yeah.
I think that having communities for atheists or people who are non-religious is maybe not something that we would see as super important as 20-year-olds with lots of friends in college, but as like adults who want to leave their religion but feel like they wouldn't have any friends if they did that. Like my parents have not left their church because they have no other friends. And being able to know that like you can explore what you think your true beliefs might be without losing a support system in your life can be really healthy.
Especially older adults. A couple people write about this in Atheists of America. Like the idea that you're approaching the end of your life, and all the systems that are set up for older adults have to do with church. Even if where you go to play bingo most of the time, it's a church. So how do you feel if you're a non-believer and you're in these spaces? You probably need it. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So, sort of the way we handle it is not to focus on the atheism. It's a secular and humanist. And virtually everybody that's part of it is an atheist. But the focus is not on the non-believers. The focus on the community and having certain humanistic values that holds together, and not just the fact. There's 2 groups of atheists, basically, the libertarians and then the liberal progressives for the most part, and they don't talk to each other, at least not nicely.
Do you think that let's just call them the libertarians, would be persuaded to join a humanist group?
Probably not.
So there's still something with, yes, we have one?
Yes.
Woo, hi. How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I'm the president of my group,
Mhm.
and I absolutely love having communities and keep my faculty separate.
Mhm.
It's well, I mean, I think that it is necessary. And we have a really cohesive group. There are plenty of socialists or diet socialists in our group. And there are plenty of liberals. And I mean, I don't know a lot of other groups work because I haven't really discussed politics with these people. But I just assume that's the biggest thing, which is fine. But I mean, yeah, I think that it's definitely something that can happen. Maybe it's just we're talking about economics. And you guys get past it. It's chill.
You solved it. So one more comment. I know you in the back you had your hand up for a while. No, right in front of you. Yeah. Is it gone? All right. Yes, you then.
I just don't see the reason, I don't know, why do we really care if people say yuck, like, oh my god, the atheist community. I don't think it's, well, at least me personally, I don't care, I'm not targeting these people. I think that's the mentality I think people should have, kind of the way, we care a lot when the religious people try to include us into what they do, their religion, their churches. I think it's the same way. I think we're starting to think, and I think that we shouldn't think that. I think we should be totally opposite of that.
Okay. So maybe a part of it is the people that have the yuck community response. Maybe we don't need to try that hard to fold them in potentially. That if they think yuck community, maybe we don't want them in our communities. But so I know that there are a lot of comments that I want to save time to do an activity. So I'm going to ask you to hold them for 1 second. I want to potentially give you something now that maybe I'm being too optimistic, maybe will help wrangle people in that are skeptical of community. So remember this thing, this minority stress model. So again, we know thousands of studies, community and social support works really well to buffer minority stress. So lots and lots of studies show this. It lessens the negative impact. And atheists really like data. So maybe actually knowing that getting involved in a community and providing them with citations for groups that are very different from us, but yet suddenly across all these groups, this still works. Maybe they would buy it, that you do need this, because we do have a unifying experience in that we're not that trusted, we're not that liked, people don't want their sons and daughters to date us. So maybe there's something to be said there with presenting them with numbers, potentially. And people have different ideas of what the atheist community could look like. So I heard somebody say, like, if their car breaks down or if they need help moving something, people have said they want an atheist community to serve the same function as churches often do, where they bring flowers or something to a sick person. Where you can be yourself, sans filter, where you can kind of collect money for a cause. So a place to find good people that you like, that you can do things with, that can take care of you in some ways when times are tough. And there already are some of these communities. So I don't want to kind of forget about that. So there's Oasis, and there are different branches of Oasis at this point. The American Ethical Union houses Society for Ethical Culture. Again, there are several branches of this across the country. Of course, there's Sunday Assembly. There's other things, woohoo, like Godless Revival in New York City, where I think they just go to a bar and like hang out and drink, which is totally fine if that's what you're looking for. But one of the things that you hear consistently when you talk to the organizers of these communities is that it's very hard to get people in chairs for the most part. So people come a couple of times and they get busy and then they drop off. And I know as secular organizers, you probably have the similar experience too. And so what I want us to do is take some time and figure out what we as individuals would actually want in these communities. All right, so I get the sense that we could talk about this for a long time, and hopefully you will continue to have these conversations. I wanted us to do this for 20 minutes, and I yammered on for way too long, so now we're doing it for 5 minutes. But in the interest of time, what I want you to do is we can just go around the room, and for those of you that were working in a group, if you can think of potentially the most unique thing that you all came up with that you would want your atheist community to offer. And we'll try not to repeat them. So, can we, start here.
Longevity, so that long after you leave the group, especially if it's a campus group, you'll be able to rely on each other in the future.
So, some sort of legacy of it, yeah. What about this group back here? Yeah.
It'd be for a group of for humanist people that share ideas about bettering mankind in general.
So humanists generally.
With including all religions, not just specifically for atheists or secular people.
Okay.
Just humanists in general.
What about activities, things that you would offer? Yeah, in the back. Yeah. Oh, Mike, okay.
Our group came up with helping tutor people.
Helping tutor people?
Yeah, for education and feeding the homeless people. So do I have an amen?
Woo. So direct activism. Did any other groups talk about doing like activism type work? Some? Okay. What else hasn't been said? Yeah.
Stuff like after school groups to help for babysitting as well as to help educate kids further.
So social good. Yeah, you guys. Purple shirt, yeah.
It's me. It's my time.
Like the problem that we see with community is, at least in my perspective, like ritual and not being able to speak out against your group without being ostracized by that group. So just basically no ritual, no dogma, just like, hey, we're gonna hang out, and if you don't like one of us, feel free to say that, because we're just a group of people. We're not an organization, and you are part of this organization until you die, that sort of thing. And I feel like that's a big problem with like church communities.
So an organization without rigid structure in some ways. Yes. Yes, yeah. You that is turning around. Sorry, I don't. Oh, it's okay. No, it's okay. Go. Sorry, you were already delivering the mic.
Oh, so I put to actually know each other, because I think that's a good thing, to actually get to know the people in your community. Because like even in like the community that you live in, like I don't know any of my neighbors at all, not a clue. I've lived there for a while, don't know any of them. So I think it'd be really nice to actually get to know people.
And I think you do that through doing awkward things like how we started this off, like hearing each other tell stories. Because how are you going to know things about each other if not?
I just want to, I was sitting in the back thinking about myself while I was running. Sometimes I just want a group of people I can get a beer with, I guess. So like that'd be cool, like pub nights are fun. Yeah.
I think we all just kind of, well, I mean, I had 3 community organizers in my group, so it's biasing it.
Unfair.
But largely similar to what we have now, but maybe a little bit bigger, more long-lasting. Actually, my group, we're maybe becoming a little too tight-knit, and so I'd like to see more new people and more not quite like close friend connections. I would love to see more friend clusters, but more clusters and more interpersonal relation.
I don't know if that's me or you.
I don't know.
I'm just going to go over here.
But more of that in our group.
Yeah. I think that's a sign of a healthy community is when you actually have friend groups that form. You're not just like a group of strangers that's showing up and, in the case of Sunday Assembly, occasionally singing Beatles songs and then going home. Like you actually need to know each other, kind of like what you were saying. So I know we're actually now 2 minutes over time, so one more comment?
I'd like to, and this is a comment rather than a sort of slightly aside. You had mentioned earlier about people who come into the group, attend a few meetings, and then leave. after about 10 years of observing this and seeing this happen over and over and over again, I've come to the conclusion that what it is they come and they meet other people who think like them and assure themselves that they're not crazy, and then they no longer have the need for the group and leave. And the reason I think that they're able to do this is because atheists, you know, with the minority issue, we have been forced to find our way in the world by ourselves. And we've become stronger people and learned how to cope. So, you know, we don't need the community as desperately. It's still nice to have, but we don't need it as desperately. We're not as needy emotionally as the people who belong to the churches.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's okay. Like, I have therapy clients that, you know, have come a couple times, they get what they need, and then they're gone. Okay, breaking my rule. Last one, go.
Hi. Okay, so you could, do a program or join a program like Big Brothers and Big Brothers and Big Sisters. Turn all the little kids into heathens. Or skeptics, at least. Don't listen to them about Santa.
So we're gonna just infiltrate other organizations and do good. Okay, I like that. So on that note, I just want to read you this quote. So this is from Pam Zerba. She was one of the contributing authors to Atheist in America. And she's a really active member of a Pennsylvania non-believer group. She wrote, "People who join Pennsylvania non-believers will often talk about how free they feel, how wonderful it is to not have to edit what you say, to hear others say all the things you've thought. It's not like we're obsessed with religion and talk about nothing else. Even when we share stories about our kids or swap recipes, that internal editor doesn't have to be switched on. And that's an enormous relief. It's our intellectual home and the place that we can be ourselves without apology." So I'm hoping that if you need this and if you want this, you can go out and co-create that. And even, you know, after graduating from college, because you can't stay in college forever, right? Hopefully, that you can work to establish these communities in your area where you're going to be living. So I'm happy to stick around and talk to people, but I want to make sure those of you that want to get out can get out. So you can email me here. You can find me on Twitter there. And thank you so much. I know it's late. I know you're tired. Thanks for being here.